All right, take it away, RJ.
Another show, another week. We've exited March successfully. It seemed like the longest March in the history of the universe there. Now, maybe we're going to have an extremely dreary April. We've now exhausted the capacity to do April Fool's jokes because reality just completely puts all of that right out the window. We've got some guests here. Colton, you little bastard. That's the man responsible for me doing week after week after week of Contested Bones. He was the
You're
one that sent me.
welcome.
And it was a delight on there. Jackson will probably be in fairly shortly. He'll plop in. He's got his activities to do. We have TD Lane here to act as occasional shill for
Yes.
the book when you have mention of that. We are about to embark, believe it or not, on another book. We're
I've got
done.
This fantastic book here. There's this fantastic book called The Rocks Existed by
And we get to have a new book.
Downwards and Weeping.
Oh,
Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species. It's a hardcover book, so that means it's serious. And
oh
it's
no.
got a bunch of extolling things from Kevin Anderson on the back and Rick Roberts and Andrew Fibbage. Right off the bat, remember source methods? It's really rudimentary. I look in the back and I discover there's a glossary, but there's no index. Oh, that makes it hard to find information in the science book, doesn't it? Isn't like an index like kind of needed? That's a problem. Then we have piles and piles of illustration and photo credits. And then finally, they get on to their 30 or 40 pages of endnotes. No bibliography. That's what I'll be doing, assembling the data field, where I'll be going through source by source and doing exactly as I did, calculating which ones are technical sources, which one are generic sources, how much of its creation is material, and when the material is publicly accessible, sharing it with all of you poor audience members out there who love to follow up on links to see what's going on, because don't take my word for it. Nobody ever has to take my word for it. Nobody should ever take anybody's word for anything. There's the I don't know how many of you ever remember Jacob Bronowski, who was a physicist and science writer way back. And he did I think it was Jacob Bronowski. I may have suffered a brain fart. Maybe it was somebody else. Anyway, it was a show on the Ring of Truth and the scientific method. Yeah, I think it wasn't Bronowski. He was doing a thing on art. I'm mind is going back to the 1970s. I'm sorry. Anyway, it was maybe it was Weinberg. Anyway, it was a PBS series that was done on it was called The Ring of Truth, and it had to do with how science works. And that's Ring of Truth analogy is an extremely good one, that when you ring the bell of any hypothesis, and if it goes, you've got a pretty good idea there's something wrong with it. Whereas real science, real truth is going, bong, and you can resonates and it connects to other things and encourages you to ignite your imagination and all of that. And so that's the principle that I hope to convey here. I think Colton does that in his own stuff. That there's such.
I linked Colton's two blog postings on the in the live chat.
Oh, thank you so much.
thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, and I really like the
everybody
actual
else. Scientist Mel, you've been doing this. Jackson doing that.
Far.
All of the science and history and stuff that we're interested in. Colton's a Titanic buff too. We spent hours talking about that.
At least 2 hours. That was beautiful.
Holy, two things we don't dare talk about to you because you're gonna go no and run away. But the thing is that all the stuff that's interesting, there's so much out there. And I was just remarking earlier how good it is that in this COVID crisis mess, we have an advantage doing shtick like this that people of 100 years ago during the great influenza that killed off millions and tens of millions of people, and my mom just barely survived it in 1919, that they didn't have advantage of that, to where we can communicate and share information and chortle over stupid creationists and do all of that with such delight. And I see most of the late night talk shows now are back on from their living rooms in doing exactly the same shtick there. I miss the laughter and I miss the insight. and the like from that, and you find out stuff you didn't know before. And so anyway, we're going to muddle through all of this independent of what certain people who shall remain nameless, like Voldemort, who are in positions of power and have head up ass, can't quite get their thing going. So anyway, on to the fun stuff. Replacing Darwin, Jeanson gets a bit of a rolling over in this tiny little tome that Jackson Wheat and I have come up with. The rocks were there. And we felt that he really deserved having the rollover on it, because he's part of that cluster of young earth creationists who masquerade as not, who don't really advertise it. You probably know Colton as well. When you've been reading through their stuff, they don't go out of their way to really say, oh, excuse me, we think the earth is only 6,000 years old and the flood took place 4,500 years ago.
Nope, not usually.
And that's another suspicious thing. If you've got an idea, it's worth defending. It's worth openly saying so. If you look like a dolt because of that, well, too effing bad. You want to be honest about what your belief is. And so that's somebody who is surreptitious and try to wiggle their little viewpoint into there. So he's got, along with Sanford's genetic entropy and the various arguments that Jeffrey Tompkins makes, they're kind of heavy gun scientists in quotation marks. They've got PhDs. Jeffrey Tompkins, I think, is still at the University of Georgia down there with a PhD.
And yet he can't use blast software for anything.
Well, you don't want to expect him to use the tools, do you? That's, I mean, after all, he's only a PhD. I mean, you're not expecting him to do that kind of stuff. But boy, they publish a lot in Answers in Genesis and at Institute for Creation Research and the Creation Research Society Quarterly and so forth and so on. They're little in-house groups where they are peer-reviewed by their peers in the young earth creationist community. And I regard that as a handy thing, because they can gripe all they like that they can't get published in Nature and Genetics and the big boy journals, but you know, we've got our work. Well, okay, they publish their articles. Everybody can see their work with all the footnotes and all the arguments and all the typefaces to look like PLOS biology and all of the details to make it all appear all fine and dandy. And people like me and Colton and Jackson and everybody else can go, ooh, we can look up the sources and we can follow them up to the extent that is possible, and most of it is. So that's what we're going to be undertaking in the next weeks as I plow through all of that. Sometimes in the wee hours of the morning, I'm just plugging in a thing and I've only got a little snippet on it. The one criteria that I always did on the previous set and will be doing here is it's got to be open access. So there may be technical citations that I can find ways of finding, and Colton and others know there are ways of finding things in many ways, but if you can't follow it because it's not instantly accessible, I'm not going to be putting a link up to it. And I want to get enough ammunition in there so that you can follow on your own. One, to check to see if the point I'm making is valid. Two, the more important thing is to ignite the fires of curiosity to where you go, wow, that's interesting. And let me find out a little bit more on it. And then you can do the next step, which is that every one of those technical papers has a pile up of technical literature on its own. So each one of those is like a spider web of interconnections. And not every single paper is going to link up to areas that you're going to be interested in. And so you can just kind of slide those aside. But hopefully there will be some people who will find something of interest where it's going to go, oop, and they're going to discover, wow, I didn't know you could find that easily, and proceed accordingly. So Colton has an interest in the geology end of things. I have to be sort of like polymath because creationists stomp on almost everything. And I'm particularly intrigued, which is stuff that's going to be coming up. We'll give you a little sneaky peek of what's happening in the next book, because there's another chapter on flood geology, and particularly the creationist model of the flood that relates to the biblical account. How?
The Hoven theory.
There will be some references to the Hoven theory, which, by the way, thanks to all of that horrifyingly long exposition of Kent Hovind, for the first time I was actually able to see the Kent Hovind theory in all of its detail.
Model's a bit too.
It's just Walt Brown for a new set of paint.
It's basically comet snowballs slam into stuff and make craters and shit and freeze.
Really? I thought Hovind was one of the ice canopy people.
Oh,
well,
he suggested that too.
It sort of is there, but it sounds like it's kind of a temporary thing, like a little temporary ice crystal. But basically, there's apparently this mega comet that somehow or other is so big that it can generate the ice crystals rings around all the various planets, in addition to crashing down after the flood's already begun. In fact, or rather, it triggers off the fountains of the deep. So this big impacts of comets, it sounded like, I suppose if you take Velikovsky and Zechariah Sitchins and mix in some Eric von Daniken and slather on a layer of Childress and a few others, then you'll kind of end up with this vague blob. Needless to say, I don't anticipate reading a technical paper, a monograph from Kent Hovind, where he will be disporting on the particular deposits on that point. The fact of the matter is that, as far as I can tell, nobody in the serious young Earth creationist field pays him the slightest attention, because it's, even by their standards, completely meaningless. So they don't really go into any of it.
Unfortunately, Tornado is not here, but if he has actually done the math on how nasty that ice comet would be. Let's just say there wouldn't be an Earth left.
Yeah, and that's in addition to all the other problems. Let's put it this way, because of accelerated radioactive decay being a problem, it would vaporize the planet, and they have the problems with the floating forests, that doesn't fit anything, and the catastrophic plate tectonics doesn't work, and every model they come up with hits some speed bump. In the field of this isn't working, Kent Hovind is way too far down the field. I mean, he contends that he's made mathematical calculations, but I kind of seriously doubt that he's going to be able to operate at the Jason Lyle level of serious mathematics. But you know,
we should be thankful for that.
Yeah, if you're out there watching this show, we urge you, write that monograph, post it for everybody to see. We'll bring popcorn. It'll be enormously entertaining for us all, and we'll just love to see how the various technical people in the various Answers in Genesis journals and others deal with it, if they do.
Hello, my name is Kent Hovind.
Yes, here's some water.
Water.
It's an odd aside, but has anybody been less open about saying where it is they taught school than Kent Hovind's alleged career of teaching science at various places? He's really.
Why does it matter? He was a high school science teacher for 15 years. Why do you want to know where? Why does it matter?
Yeah, well, it'd be kind of fun to find out, whether it's a parking lot or something now.
I do think I've heard, I don't know if it was from him specifically, but it was like private Christian schools.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
You can't be surprised.
Gary Parker was in the same boat. He was a teacher of things, and it's relatively minor. But I could give a rat's ass about their curriculum vitae. It's what they present up front, and there's no front there. That's the problem. Anyway, there's going to be, in the course of this, the analysis will be, he's got a hell of a lot of charts, and he's got some pretty pictures. He's got a lot of color plates. You see, we got your Grand Canyon there, and after all, Jeanson, being a non-geologist, is obviously going to be right up his alley to be describing things about geology.
Let me guess. I see black and white. Is he trying to show how much erosion happened?
Oh, this number, the black and white one is Mount St. Helens. That's a volcanic.
Oh my God, this again?
Yeah. And the canyon below Mount St. Helens on that
doesn't
side
look anything like the Grand Canyon.
And if you had somebody standing there, that of course, by the way, is taken right after the eruption, because it sure as hell ain't there now. I had the delight. I live in Spokane, Washington, which I shoveled Mount St. Helens off my driveway, and again in 1980. So I'm more than casually familiar with it. And as it turns out, they opened up the volcano for some visitors in July of 1980. And we were there lickety split driving our old Chrysler LeBaron up the windy little road through the blasted landscape. You couldn't get really close enough to see the crater area. They only had one little section open, but it was the eeriest experience that I've ever had in my life. And there's roads all over the place and visitor museums. There's a whole bunch of stuff there now because it's all been growing back, partly because they've been planting new greenery there, but also because plants come back. And those canyons and rivulets and blast areas, it's not rock. It's tough. And it can congeal to a certain extent, but most of the time the water just erodes away, boop, and gone.
You'll notice that the walls of these canyons end up slumping pretty easily because they don't have the strength to hold themselves together.
Because they ain't rock. And that's the one that everybody needs to remember with any young Earth creationists. As soon as they start bringing out their, well, we can experimentally create layers of things inside of a dish. Is it rock? Kent Hovind keeps on talking. He can just take his little things and he can shake it and make little layers. Is it rock? How do you get it to be rock? And nobody, not Snelling, not Woodmorath, not Ord, not Clary, not only have they not done that experimentally in any way, shape, or form, but they don't even cite anybody who's ever tried to do that. Because
Austin, as of late, has been getting very into mud rock, and he's trying to like convince creationists to make a racetrack flume to prove how mudstones could be rapidly deposited in Noah's flood.
Yeah.
All he's going to do is rediscover turbidite currents, which we've known about since the 50s.
Yeah, and that's why when you look
I'd
at
be
like
shocked, I'd say.
Berthollet, Claude Berthollet, you'll find him in the book. There's a bunch of sections on his work because he's the darling of young Earth creationists. He's popped up a lot in that, and you even see him kind of appearing off in the corners of intelligent design because there are people like Salvador Cordova, who is a young Earth creationist, but he posts a lot and doesn't usually tell that he's a young Earth creationist. Yeah, well, Jackson had him on his show, which was a hilarious experience. There is a guy who has fog in between the ears. He is not nearly up to speed on his own material.
He was under the impression that the faint young sun paradox was supposed to overcome snowball Earth, which happened in the Cambrian. I mean, that was late
Precambrian, but it's a couple billion years later. Sal
thought snowball Earth was in the Cambrian.
Oh, he did. Oh, poor thing. Isn't he precious?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm shocked to imagine that a young Earth creationist has problem with geochronology and map of time.
Yes.
That's another thing I want to instill in everybody. If they interact with a young Earth creationist and they start tossing, which they will, your origins or bust stuff, well, where did life come from? Pin them down on when they think that happened. Get them to be clear about that. Because even the non-young Earth creationists out there really have only a nebulous idea of what the hell's going on. They're probably thinking lions and tigers and bears, oh my. They're not thinking chinorynchs and protistants. And so they're really going to have a very, very vague notion of it because all of their sources are extremely vague, from intelligent design all the way over to the young Earth creationists. It's funky if you find a particular taxa that has an early evolutionary roots. Sponges are an example of that, and early metazoans, platyhelminth, flatworms, stuff like that. Try to find the creationist or intelligent design discussion of any of those particular taxa, and you will discover never. They just talk about them as gee whiz. Oh, aren't they wonderful and amazing, and the God creator to make something or other, but not when they think they lived and when they think they were created in their model, because they don't have a model. That's why they don't ever do it. So those map of time issues are super duper critical. Everybody should make use of them. It's a thing you need to do yourself. If you don't have a clear map of time in your own head, don't go wading into it. I'm sure, Colton, you try to clarify in your own head the chronology of things, I would wager.
Yeah, constantly. Not just for the actual history of the world, but for theirs, because the last thing I want to do is end up strawmanning them and making myself look bad.
Yeah, and it's often hard to understand what they think on it because it's so bloody vague that you're trying to go, when do you think this happened? And that's why it gets hilarious. We've got sections, continual plug for the book, that there are sections in there where we're pointing out how creationist A is saying, oh, this is pre-flood. And creationist B is saying, no, that's actually post-flood. And creationist C is saying, no, actually, that's flood. And creationist D saying, we can't actually make up our minds where any of this stuff fits into the framework. You will not see that stuff typically brought forward in the apologetic literature. It's buried down in the little footnote hissy fits that go on in the back corners of AIG and ICR and in their technical journals. But when you get up to the surface apologetics of what the pundits are saying in their glossy little posts that Snelling will be putting up that largely are devoid of footnote references, a thing you could spot right off the bat with most of the front door apologetics that AIG will post on Twitter, for example, it's there a general summary piece that's got links to somewhere else that may be linking to somewhere else that may be linking to somewhere else. You're way far away from a model at that point. And you're way far away from all the controversies. They don't want you to know there are all those controversies, but they want to have every controversy of evolution right up front. And because they have a little disagreement on this versus a little disagreement on that, well, they can throw the whole thing out. Well, can't we play that game too? So we can therefore argue that Answers in Genesis and all their creation models have no model. They're in their own mess. Yeah. Vesta, I got to agree with you. Scientist Mel as well, thinking things might have a small chance to get back to normal in June. We've got a bunch of things. There was going to be Hoop Fest, which was a gigantic masses of basketball players that take over downtown and all this stuff that's going on. We have our in May, we have our I think it's either May or early June, the marathon here. Well, all of that's up in the air. All the sport, Gonzaga's primo basketball team, all of that stuff grinds to a halt, the football teams and all that. So for ESPN, they're going to have to learn how to knit or maybe build a suspension bridge or something as a hobby out of Legos.
Esports. Esports. That's the only way. Also, hi, Jackson.
Hi, Jackson is here. Yay!
Hello. Hi, my name is Jackson. Hi,
we have not
Jackson.
seen you ever before. You are a complete stranger to us.
I imagine so. I'm a strange even to myself.
Hello, my name is Jackson Wheat.
I was telling him that the plan is that probably June-ish, maybe, we will be diving back into working on the second novel once you get past all of your school situation there, and I'm plugging in my backlog of references and the like, and we will be back to it with a little vengeance to make another book.
Going around to pass everyone right now, so.
Yeah, it's anybody who's ever actually seriously written a book knows that you really have to get obsessed with it and get knee deep in it. And it starts occupying your time where, stampede of gazelle going through the room. No, you don't pay any attention to that. That you're just doing the operation. And I've said before, there was a quote that I've taken greatly to heart that Martin Gardner said, that if you want to know how little you know about a subject, start writing a book about it. That the kind of level you would do for blogs or for articles and the like, if you write a serious book and take it seriously, not that people like this guy is taking it seriously from my end of it, because it's total page number, only about 300 pages, 330, and that's without an index and without a bibliography. And
Wow.
And it's in pretty good typeface, and they got a lot of pictures. So I'm going to be measuring to see just how many sources are actually involved in it.
He's
and
not
how all that builds now.
not writing in tiny letters on like 500 pages.
Yeah, somebody that has to whittle the bibliography down to 6-point instead of 7-point to keep it under the 820 9-page limit or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I did pay attention to the readability of the text, however. In fact, I had my niece's husband who has glasses as well, and I vetted him on the image that I had on the screen, and I printed out the pages and stuff. It says, how readable is this? And it says you should put an extra spacing between the paragraphs to make it a little bit easier to read, which is exactly what I did. So I think it's a more workable text than Slam Dunk was, and it certainly got more text than Slam Dunk had.
No
text.
shit.
There is a little bit of text in it. Just
Yeah,
a
well,
little.
we have to blame AIG
Oh.
on this. I mean, it's all their fault for writing 4 stupid books that we insisted on diving into and pulling apart 100% of their content. And so we've gotten chapter by chapter, bit by bit. If they're going to go to all the trouble of putting this shit out, we can go to all the trouble of ripping it to shreds. Now let me
That's
make
true.
a pause. We're about halfway through. Let me thank our patrons. I got to tell the patrons, holy smokes, given how panic-stricken the world is at the moment, I was not at all going to be shocked if any of the patrons said, wait a minute, I've got other important tasks to deal with. I'm going to, stop giving money to RJ on the Patreon. And so far, every one of you has stayed in. Holy moly. This is thank you, because I fully understand. Dapper Dino does exactly the same thing when he tells about his Patreon account. He said, don't you dare give money to me before you can give to some important things. So if you got some stuff to spare, fine and dandy. I'm more than anxious and delighted to have it, and it makes a big difference. This April is going to be funky because this is the first month where I've expanded to the point where I'm no longer being subsidized by Washington State for my Medicare. So that suddenly pulls money out of my Social Security and juggle. And then, of course, that's independent of COVID, suddenly putting everything into a panic in that. So April, the fact that income tax, I bet everybody is sighing in relief that they don't have to necessarily file their income tax in the middle of April. I got my property tax coming up. So there's a whole bunch of things. So anyway, let me thank the people who have not abandoned the old RJ. Our colleagues Henril and Eric and Speed of Sound and Surus and Zeshi, who Surus's account was hijacked recently, and he's been trying to get back up to speed on that one. That's something that I have never experienced, knock wood. Hopefully that will not happen. Our researchers, Travis and Convert and Eat and James and History Minor and Ralph and Pelagia. And thank you, Pelagia, again for the Uber plug that you helped on the rocks were there. That was a biggie, I can tell you. We both know the spike in book sales as a result in that. Thank you. Our assistant researchers, Mike and Ian and Duranku and Benjamin and Totis Real. Our friends Daniel and Steve Bauman, another geologist guy, vetted our geology material. Marigale and Insects and Devin and Morton and Paul, Skeptic and Puffalophagus and Bo and Staggles and Alex and Paul. And then again, the legacy patrons who helped at times when they could and had to move on to other things. Jen and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dyer and Yui and Mona and Brad and Daniel and Yanya and Son and Ugly Chum and Truths and Everett and Sewer. Thank every single one of you for helping out. It makes a big difference to keeping things juggling from one bit to another. And Jackson and I certainly are going to be plugging away on all of our projects on there because there's so much stupid out there that still needs to be taxonomized and clarified and brought up to date. And if there's one thing that Jackson and I are both proud of is the idea of being current. So we're not writing a criticism of creationism where we're talking really great deal about what Dwayne Gish was saying in 1995 or what Ken Ham was doing in 2002. No. This is what their heavy guns, the Jeansons and the Sanfords and the Snellings are spewing out in 2015, 2018, 2019. So you're up to speed on their twaddle, saving you all that effort of having to plow through all that crap. If you want to, you can find the references and follow it up on your own if you feel like it. And I certainly encourage other masochists to plow ahead with all that stuff. But it's a thing that, given how creationism has not gone away, and who would have thunk in when Ken Ham was just getting started in the 1990s, that they would have two giant museums, that they would have the website penetration and stuff that they do, that Institute for Creation Research can afford to send R.J. Downard every month Acts and Facts hard copy for free. What kind of money do they got flowing around over in there? Holy moly. So we got a lot to fight against, but we just have the facts on our side. I'm sorry. And it's interesting to pull it all together and to get more and more and more and more and more and more people onto the bandwagon, so that the goal is that any creationist that sticks their stupid head up and copies off more of the day will come when people will be copying Standing for Truth posts. You realize that, where
God
of course
help
he's just
us.
Sooner
it's
or
gonna
later,
happen.
I mean, they don't exactly have that many young guys going in to follow the professionals.
It's a limited field that if you look at them, most of the, my God, I don't think anybody has ever actually seen John Woodmarapp in the flesh. He's must be at least my age. Who knows? He might look like a desiccated skeleton from What We Do in the Shadows. I don't know. He doesn't put a picture up. Sarfati has been around since the ancient days. He's one of the old crowds of the older. For those of you who are unaware of the history of creationism, it's kind of a funky a bit to deal with. I put one of my postings, tip 1.6, which covered the early days of things, to where you kind of get a speed of what was going on with the formation of the Institute for Creation Research and that crowd. It circulated around in part Jerry Falwell, Rush Dooney, who is at the core of the Dominionist political movement in hyper right-wingism. He was knee-deep in that creationist movement. He was one of the helm that helped get the first publication of the Genesis flood going. So there's a network of things that are buried down in the footnotes that was taking place back in the 60s and 70s, and it hit a high water mark in the 1980s when you had a lot of legislators that were trying to put in equal time stuff to teach it in the public schools. That slammed into that pesky Supreme Court that said, can't do that. And so then there was a retooling with the intelligent design movement. Pandas and People started from a creationist context and then pared it down to air quotes intelligent design, or C design propentiists, as some of the references were in their early drafts. And then meanwhile, the creationists wouldn't go away. So you found the new breed, Ken Ham's bunch from Australia. Australia's loss was our gain when he comes to the United States. And then there was a big fission. So anybody that's aware of it, they will have encountered Creation Ministries International. That was the part of the Answers in Genesis bunch that couldn't stand Ken Ham and his finagling of the money. So they split off and formed a separate diocese of stupid and continued to their day. And so some of their journals of the old unified period have been at the CMI website. You can tell who got the kids as to which one of the websites they pop up to. And then you have Kent Hovind percolating around, who keeps on ticking, even though he doesn't have any brain part, operating way at the bottom end of things. And you're going to find your Matt Powells and your Standing for Truth. There's a whole new generation of parasitical following the parasites, to where they trawl bits and pieces of the upper level official creationists, but they're running off of the energy and networking of the Kent Hovind level. So it's always important to kind of keep all of that stuff straight. I don't think today, it's really rare to find somebody citing Duane Gish. He pops up just peripherally, sometimes stuck in a little footnote somewhere. They might allude to him. But because he's been dead for 14 years now, and his books, the last big one he did was Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No, bum, bum, bum. from 1995, which I went into an awful lot of that in Dynamania. So a lot of that stuff doesn't come up in The Rocks Were There because we're dealing with the ones that are active today, not the stuff that was going on when National Center for Science Education was formed and the old apologetics that you would find a lot of at Talk Origins. They're aiming at a different block, a different demographic of this old print-based group. So we've now got a lot of YouTubes. I've just sort of stumbled in to the fact that there's this mass of stupid that's exclusively on YouTube. So Standing for Truth is not going to write his monograph. The book he co-wrote with Matt Powell is a incoherent mess that they have
that
up
the geology one they tried?
You mean Romat?
Yeah, I saw it up on their website. It ran on for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages.
I know they had a book about like they're trying to come up with some model of flood geology, and one of the things they brought up was how could you have people building with granite slabs unless the granite was soft? Yeah, that was my reaction. Apparently, they don't understand.
Yeah,
that
the silly putty
magma.
approach to prehistoric megaliths. Yes, they just extruded Stonehenge like out of a toothpaste tube.
Yep.
Magma toothpaste.
Yeah,
they
I
literally
love it.
argued that they smacked it into place. It was the stupidest thing I've read in a while.
Another one to take note of that wasn't active until fairly recently was David Kopej, and he is the guy that was fired from the Jet Propulsion Lab. He's done some technical work and was employed by them, and apparently is an annoying prick. And his website is this vomit of criticism and snarks at the technical literature, and this stuff then gets parasitized secondarily, where they'll rely upon Kopej. But when I saw Standing for Truth in the other guy's book, it looked like someone had taken David Kopej posts and ran them through a blender and then put them out as a smoothie of just completely discordant, incoherent mess on a green background, that there was no rhyme or reason as to why they were discussing what they were in the order that they were, which means fact-checking it would be just laborious, absolutely horrifying, because you'd have to go down link by link by link, and there's no order to it. So you then would be encountering 20, 30, 40, 50 pages farther down the same topic again with another slightly peripheral link. No, this makes it awkward to do source analysis, but not impossible. And so anybody that wants to be that diligent, at least the typical creationist text is organized. They've got headings and they've got stuff grouped into material where you can start tracking down what the salient points are to then identify what is the litmus test technical references where you can go, ooh, that's an interesting claim. And they've cited just one source for it.
Well, that's like their one of the things that was just fractally stupid that they said was that all beneficial mutations were epigenetically caused, which the very fact that phrase exited someone's mouth and they thought it was a good thing to say is astounding.
It's although epigenetics plays an interesting role in regulation, it isn't about mutations.
No, exactly. Yeah. It's just like, have they even bothered to look up the definition of epigenetics?
Why are you asking that question? You already know the answer is no.
I apologize. You know
I know that's true. You know, it would be sort of like you were arguing that your gear shift in the car is the cause of the nail in your flat tire.
I mean, these guys are just fractally incompetent when it comes to reading paper. Yeah, it's stupid compiled on stupid.
And so a Kent Hovind level or a Standing for Truth level who knows only what they have copied so diligently and memorized with such amazing energetic fidelity, but know nothing beyond that. And was the moment you try to ask them a question about it, as you've done, Jackson, suddenly you get crickets. We have a different standard for people like Georgia Purdom and Jeffrey Tompkins and others who allegedly have degrees. And so they have no excuse for the Purdom is just gobsmacking in some of the material that she claims about her alleged field of biology. There's no business for her to say that sort of thing.
No business for her to hide her sources in the.
Hide the ball, and hide the model. I was saying before you arrived that one of the things that pisses me off and that everybody needs to be mindful of with creationism is, what the hell's their model? Go ahead and tell us what your model is. And Method's question, the killer app, if you want to get cricket sounds from anybody that you're interacting with in creationism, you ask them a source methods question that they can't answer, which is to explain what they think. They've got the tropes. They can spew the tropes. And it's fun. One of this, she pops up peripherally and then she'll go away. I think she's married to another creationist, and then occasionally she comes back again. She tried to, when I brought up my killer app, which is the reptile mammal transition, she tried to drop Woodmarap on me without mentioning his name. She started talking about the argument that Woodmarap was making, that these cladistic analyses and that. I knew exactly where she got this from. There's only one source online she could have got it from, which is Woodmarap's 2001 article, which I go into an entire chapter in the Evolution Slam Dunk.
Indeed.
And you couldn't get her to either own up to where she got it from or defend it. And so she just kind of backs off from that and then kind of winces every time. Well, RJ's going to bring up the therapsids again. Yeah. and I'm waiting for you to explain it. So that's the thing, is that one of the things, it'd be fun because you were a young Earth creationist, Colton, and I wasn't. But when I was in my, okay, let's look at this phase in the 1980s, I inevitably thought through, well, what would an actual flood look like? What would it do? First of all, you'd find fossil graveyards up the yin-yang. You wouldn't find fragmentary things. You'd find all these fabulously preserved things that are being smushed together in an absolutely chaotic thing, because whatever was like in the cubic mile is going to be slammed together. So there would be no coherent order of things, but amazingly good preservation elements, and the kinds of slurry that you would have forming and then somehow consolidating into rock. It would be absolutely unmistakable. And it's exactly what you don't get in the actual fossil record. Your experience, Colton, what did you think about that?
So one of the things that I really like to hear was this argument of the layers are like flat like pancakes and you don't see big things of surface erosion in them. And then somebody brought up the Surprise Canyon formation inside the Grand Canyon. That's a big Paleo Valley system carved into the Redwall limestone,
which has been sedimentized inside.
And I was like, okay, like I had this moment of, okay, wait, the flood might be able to channel stuff. And then somebody's like, by the way, in the base of it, you find these 30-foot in diameter blocks of the underlying red wall, meaning the red wall was solid stone before this Paleo Valley was carved. And I was like, shit, I don't know what to do with that.
Hey, have you
really getting kind of like alarms going off in the head going,
yeah, it was a weird feeling.
You're familiar with Sicker Point, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I like that one. I think that's pretty, that's a neat one. And I've tried bringing it up a couple times to different creations. And it's like, how do you get a layer, then an eroded layer, then another layer on top of that?
And it's layer.
It's weird. You have to have the entire thing be laid down. And the thing, you have to remember what the environment at the bottom of Sicker Point is too, because it's a alternating series of shale and gray wackle, which is turbidite deposits.
Oh, and yeah, so I love it. Jackson introduced me to that damn word. I had not heard gray wacka before he did his section on that, and I was thankful.
So you have to get these turbidites that come in catastrophically, and then things have to calm down so that way shale can settle out, and then it happens again and again and again in a repeated cycle. Whole thing gets uplifted, so the process stops, lithifies into solid stone, tilts, erodes,
eroded again,
gets subducted below sea level. Then the old red sandstone comes. Whole thing gets uplifted again, tilted, and then you have
each one indicative of paleo environments that internally make consistent sense, but are different from the ones before or after. It's just a mess like that. And
I posted on Twitter last night, creationists will not touch facies modeling. because there is no way that I should be able to predict what a rock should look like when I drill in a basin based only off its age and my hypothesized depositional environment, and get it right if that depositional environment is wrong.
One that I brought up in the Dinomania chapter was, I think, the Coconino sandstone, which is the little beach ripples.
Have you seen Whitmore's response to that?
I may have, but the thing that the point about how I put it in the book, I was quite pleased about. It's, imagine that you have a tea shop, and you've got all of the teacups and all the stuff in place. And imagine the idea, because you've got layer on layer on layer of these little ripple marks that go up the thing, as this reflects a lot of time according to the standard model. In a flood, it's as if a tidal wave comes along and slams into the tea shop, pushing everything over and keeping all of the teacups and the saucers in place on the tables next to the tablecloth and the knives and the fork. No, there's something wrong with this model.
Yeah, Whitmore was trying to make the argument that it was subaqueous, and he tried to prove that like the preserved raindrop imprints in the Coconino were not actually raindrops. And I showed this to Jackson, and his raindrops that looked anomalous weren't raindrop imprints. They were scorpion tracks. Whitmore missed the tail drag mark going right through the middle. Yeah. The neat thing about geology, astounding. The real geology is, I remember watching a wonderful science series that was on our local public access channel, probably in the 1980s or so. And it was on the various flume experiments that were done to show how different water rates and particle size then, and also sand dunes. And the point is that the way water deposits stuff and the way air deposits stuff and the way it moves, depending upon temperature and current and all the rest, differs in extremely specific ways. That tidal estuaries will have a different kind of dynamic than rivers coming down into a sea. Something that's deep benthic will have a different dynamic than something that is a sand dune up in the desert. The particle structures are totally different. And they all relate to each other, so you can trace them laterally. And you can figure out where each of them will be when you go look later.
Yeah.
And there's no reason you should be able to do that. You shouldn't be able to tell paleo environment in the first place.
Yeah, and the
not if a flood happened.
Yeah, it should just be one paleo habitat.
Yeah, Well, with the little ocean down here, and then a little ocean up there, and we have the dinosaurs over here, and the Dimetrodons down here.
Roth and his stupid isolated seas was the worst thing I have seen in a long time. Hey, why aren't the whales found with the marine reptiles when they both share the same environment? Well, I guess they do.
It isn't as though whales swim in water, like, do they? That one lowly little whale would just be paddling along there, or some barracuda that's known for speed just accidentally just kept on swimming during the flood, and its little spear went right through the front end of a plesiosaur. Now that would be damned impressive.
I'm still trying to figure out how the flood didn't kill all the marine life.
Yeah, remember, they claim that the water stratifies
fresh water.
Oh, and remember, the oceans are coming up because of the melting of the giant snowball, according to the Hovind theory.
How many times have they killed everything on the planet? I know they've beaten God.
It's like 10 times. Yeah.
With catastrophic plate tectonics, several dozen times over.
And doesn't
hydroplate, you're literally cooking the planet with steam cooking.
Oh, I mean, it gets worse with the tectonics.
What is it? The ice canopy, the vapor canopy, the pressure that would be required to sustain the vapor canopy would cook the surface of the planet.
But wasn't that the pressure that allowed the oxygen concentration?
Vesta says, neat thing. James Dowder, don't you just love KSPS Spokane? I get that station in Calgary. Yes, you do. Our public broadcasting channels in here are connected to Canada. So we have, We're across, we're not that far from the border, and our signal connects beyond the border. So we have people who contribute to our public broadcasting station from Edmonton because they see it on their feed. It's part of their networking system. So we are like an international network in here. We have 2 public radio stations, one that was from a local college that then they had to switch over, so that got took over. So we have 2 public broadcasting channels on our cable system. We've got the KSPS and the public broadcasting system from Idaho's college channels. So I'm just with a glut of multiple options. So different shows are on different mixes and at different times and all that kind of stuff. So yes, Vesta, yay, KSPS. We've got a wonderful channel here. And by the way, Vesta, since you get that every once in a while, I think usually in the summertime, KSPS shows the Memories of Natatorium Park, or Remember When, I think it's called, the Memories of Natatorium Park. I'm in that around minute 50 because I designed an amusement park, and the images of that are around 50 minutes in there. So I'll put that in the little commentary in here. The Remember When show, and it's shown every once in a while. It's online too. You can get it on YouTube. Remember When, Natatorium Park. Yeah, so in addition to my writing science books and doing novels, Natatorium, and the such like, I also designed an amusement park. Disneyland on a big scale. So that's a little side thing. I have lots of interests.
No.
Back to geology and stupid.
I have only one: bringing down capitalism. No.
Well, I'm a market capitalist, so we will fight it to the death. All that. That's another bit that you have to remember when dealing with creationism is the political demographic that they represent.
Bringing
Not
down capitalism.
Just the anti part.
If I met a hardcore Marxist creationist, I don't know how I'd handle that situation.
Yeah,
it would be amazing to think of that. In fact, I describe creationism as Coulter Camp conservative religious. That's the demographic, and that has been the demographic.
Although to be fair, though, the Leninists were the Lysenkoists were anti-Darwinism. Yeah. So
and screwed everything up royally. About the only non-conservative anti-evolutionist that I can think of offhand was William Jennings Bryan. And that was in the early days of anti-evolutionism in the 1920s. He was a lefty, wanted to nationalize railroads, and he was a pacifist, and he was off the full left thing. But he was deeply religious and was deeply pissed off, and rightfully so, at the Germans, who were a hotbed of social Darwinist way of thinking of things, and thinking that they were the masters of the world because it was natural evolution to do so. And so there was a legitimate degree of argument. I went into a lot of that in the history. I think it's in tip 1. Either 1.6 or 1.7 on the role of eugenics, and the textbook that was actually used regarding the Scopes trial. That came from a kind of what we would now consider rather retrograde stuff. And you get these little political hissy fit stuff that goes on because a lot of the people who were evolution defenders were left-wingers and continue to be. Stephen Jay Gould comes from the left wing of things. Richard Lewontin is a bloody communist. I'm not making it up. Yes. And so there's
Dawkins has no love for the Republicans.
Yeah. But whereas evolution has a huge political mix to it, where there are politically conservative evolutionists and politically liberal evolutionists, anti-evolutionism is almost exclusively hyper-conservative. And as we spotted along the way, there's the curious detail that liberals and conservatives tend to have different personality types. And therefore, we can presume that there's going to be different cognitive architecture underlying that. So there is, to some extent, a kind of a creationist brain. They do tend to be a little bit more prone to conspiracy thinking.
Tortugan, you might even call them.
Tortugans. Yes, it's almost as though someone coined a handy word to describe the mindset without being pejorative. Because I do not label them as stupid people. I mean, Philip Jeanson wasn't stupid. He was a very bright intellect, and you find a lot of the very bright people can be wrong. And when you look at how they're wrong, it's because their method's bad. And so you start looking underneath the data field and the content to start looking at how they're approaching source field. What are they paying attention to? Are they prone to apologetic arguments? Are they prone to secondary sources that they don't fact check? Do they avoid following through on what they think happened? Do they avoid working out their model? And so you can see this when you start having a pattern where it turns out 100% of the people that you're dealing with all share that trait. That's kind of a significant thing. So the transitional fossil issue is one that I'm particularly concerned with, because it's a matter where if you can find an anti-evolutionist that will actually think what a transitional fossil would look like that they would accept, please let me know, because literally their brains do not think that. They go there. So it's whatever you bring up, they'll say, well, show me the evidence. And you show them the evidence and they find ways to give it the middle finger and move on. But you ask them, well, what would it need to look like for you not to give it the middle finger? No. And their brain goes into mode, and that's the less you can hear. Colton, have you ever encountered anybody that's ever been able to describe what a transitional form would look like? And when you were a creationist, were you ever thinking about that?
When I was a creationist, I tried not to think about transitional fossils too often because, like I don't know if I ever said it to you, but I know I said it to Jackson. I kind of think I was more of like a Kurt Wise type. I was much more open to the concept of evolution. I didn't think it was poopy stupid. I just thought that I had a biblical basis for a different view, and I was trying to find scientific evidence to support it, and that didn't turn out too well. But when I do recall cringing whenever my youth pastors would say that transitional fossils were things along the lines of crocoduck or anything along that sort that were clearly chimeric.
The cow
was like, that's
the whale
not
with the cow's udder. Dwayne Gish's cartoon of the whale with the cow's udder.
So I think I always did understand on some level that it was supposed to be sort of a basal form with traits of both.
Yeah.
But I never really gave it too much thought.
And Jackson, you've known every single time you try to bump into something, and not only at the paleontology end, but at the biological end. That's the same thing that afflicts intelligent designers. You say, okay, what would a non-designed Michael B. He says that he doesn't claim that all complex systems are irreducibly complex. Okay, dive into a complex system that you concede is not irreducibly complex, and he kind of waves it off. Cycle, and then doesn't ever think about it again.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. Creationists, the intelligent designers are okay with Darwinism right up to the point you ask them to give you a specific example, and then it's yikes. Because like if you look at Stephen Meyer, for instance, Meyer says, you have the chordate type, right? You have Haikuikti, the chordates just came into existence. Okay, all right, fine. Let's say they did. Are you okay with an elephant and a tunicate being related? Is there a single path of evolution from tunicates to elephants?
At that point, they're not going to accept that. In fact, one of the canards that pisses me off is one where it's saying we don't reject common descent necessarily. It's not part of the intelligent design doctrine. Well, bullpucky, the only two who technically sort of kind of do accept common descent would be Michael Denton and Michael Behe. And if you read their stuff, you discover they don't actually apply it to any example at all, ever.
No.
So they supposedly accept speciation. You try to find out where Denton thinks any species is related to any other species. I dare you. And the same thing with Michael Behe. It's all a fog bank. So it's this, it's like you're saying, I think there could be a bridge across the river, but I never actually think about it and I never offer one and I don't ever go there. And meanwhile, I'm staying on my side of the river and please don't bother me again with that. And that's what it boils down to. And
yeah,
so
you're right.
Too real.
Yeah. So those are litmus test methods questions, because they're simultaneously isolating their understanding or lack of it of the data field like I was describing to Colton, the deer in the headlight moment with the Timoshin Lagerstätten that I had with Stephen Meyer, my glorious moment of holy shit with
I
him.
haven't thought about it.
Yeah. And well, the same thing happened at long distance with Steve Meyer. I recounted this in the Three Back Revolutionary episodes, and then I think I alluded to it kind of briefly in Evolution Slam Dunk on the birds. But I wanted to test this out. I had already tested it out with
You
Philip
mean
Jeanson.
Jonathan Wells?
Hmm?
You meant Jonathan Wells. You had it
Jonathan
long
Wells,
distance with
yeah.
Jonathan Wells. Yeah.
Yeah,
I told him
I'd
about
already-
that actually. I did tell him about that one.
Yeah, that Wells was saying that Archaeopteryx is not a good example of a transitional form for birds. Well, that immediately suggested to me to ask him, okay, what would be a perfect transitional form? And I was like the most Byzantine lawyer to word it in such a way that I couldn't trigger his reflexes to think that maybe this was from a non-believer. I couldn't go the usual route because an awful lot of these people in their own internal communications will end with "bless you" and "God be with you." I mean, they're openly conveying their religious convictions. So I had to word it very carefully, like I'm just a curious, intelligent design person from out then in Spokane, and I was asking about this. I couldn't email him. He did, even though this was in the email era, he didn't have an email address. I had to write the damn Discovery Institute, and I was kind of thinking it probably wouldn't get anything. But finally, he answered back, and it was like manna from heaven, because he literally said, gee, I've never thought about what a perfect transitional would look like. But Archaeopteryx is a bad transitional. I couldn't get him to think about the thing at issue, because the moment he tried to do that, to lay out what the taxonomical features of what a theropod looks like and what a bird looks like and what the bones are and orbital fenestra and semi-lunate carpal bones and pelvic arrangements and pygostyle formations and just list them all out, gastralia bones. The moment you try to work out how you could get from one to the other, you discover we already have the one to the others. We've got the transitional forms. They're doing exactly what you would expect them to do. And individual lineage, then they try to parse. It's going to be fun to see what happens now that we are on the field with our book because of our 35 genera of feathered theropods. Because one of the things about is that a chunk of those, 5 or 6 taxa, predate Archaeopteryx. All of Jonathan Wells's argument about Deinonychus is that, oh, this is tens of millions of years after Archaeopteryx. It can't be ancestral. Well, what about these that we now know predated Archaeopteryx? Take a whack at that one, Jonathan.
Yeah, the whole group of Anchiornithines they're so bird-like that I think pretty much all of them have been within Avialae at one point. They've all kind of they started there, and like one by one they've kind of gone like they have a few characteristics that sort of put them just out of crown Avialae, but they're like right next to it. You have Anchiornis, Aurornis, which may be the same thing. What else? You have a couple other ones, which Eosinopteryx, that's another one. Pedopenna, and so it's like, you know, oh, and there was a paper that came out recently which put Archaeopteryx actually amid the dromaeosaurs. Did you see that paper, Colton?
No.
It's not the first one. There was actually a paper back in 2018 which put Archaeopteryx amongst the dromaeosaurs, and so some researchers are kind of like, well, maybe it actually isn't a bird at all, which would be hilarious.
That would be pretty hilarious.
I come from an era as an old fart before the formes and classification category. Now you got your Crocodiliiformes and your Mammaliiformes and your Dinosauriformes and your Sauropodomorphs and all that. In other words, you've got all of these almosts and nearlies and just abouts in the big blob period between the things that were earlier and the things that are definitely. And the number of it in there, I can be sympathetic in a cruel, nasty sort of way to the creationists who don't dare step into that quagmire and try to deal with all of that data field, because it's going to just bog them down in a quicksand that they will be disappearing below the taxa field in one thing. Here was the chart that we put in our teeny tiny little book. the listings of the feathered theropod genera
Yeah.
with the technical references on it. 350.
Oh, and where would that be?
And there's not 1, not 2,
That's
not
in
3, not 4,
chapter
not 5, not 6, not 7,
four.
not 8, not 9, 10
Wait.
genera of feathered
6, I think.
theropods that predate Archaeopteryx, the Anchiornithidae and the
See,
one
one,
I can never pronounce, the
two.
Scansoridae.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, yeah, the
350 and
Scansoriopter.
351?
Hmm?
Pages 350 and 351?
Yeah,
Yep.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every
this-
one of them is listed with the tech. You could you can
I
get a
think that's
gauge
chapter
of how recent
6.
so much of this material is, because not only did we just want a chart, but we wanted the damn technical papers right in the chart, so you can follow up on your own on it. And it's just.
You know, the Scansoriopteridae is very interesting because they're in the recent paper that put Archaeopteryx in the Dromaeosaur put Scansoriopteridae as sister to the Avialae, which is interesting because that puts Yi and the other bat-like theropod as really close to the birds, which is some really interesting implications.
Oh yeah, and what's going to be interesting in the paleogenomics department, it's only a matter of time as they ferret more and more through the bird genome and looking more and more at paleogenomic reconstructions and tweaking the genetic systems and working out what the morphological impact is of various mutations there to be able to reconstruct those earlier forms. It's in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that data field is going to be more and more and more that the creationists will have to avoid. And so I want us kids to be on that data field, so when it comes in, we will be able to wave it at them and dare them as our data field, the curve gets farther and farther ahead of them, and they're still trying to toss off, well, what good is half a wing?
Sorry, the
Your
90s
egg's
is
warm.
calling.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 90s is
You mean the
calling.
80s, practically.
Well, you still
Possibly
find
even, yeah.
Kent Hovind's brain is buried back in that older apologetics. He's still trotting out stuff that he learned in the creationism of the Duane Gish era. He's still trotting out Archaeopteryx as a
Kent
fraud,
Hovind's brain
which
is just a bone in the dirt.
Yeah. And so he's very far away. Copege and that crowd are more dangerous in their own way because they're actually kind of looking at the current incoming literature. So they're snarking on that. You'll get recent technical literature in several examples on the reptile mammal transition. It was Copege who was kind of poking at it badly, but at least he was. But over in Kent Hovind land, he's 8,000 miles away from that data field. He's not going to be looking at any of that stuff. And I'd love to know what keeps him from doing it. I mean, is there some little palsy in his hand that prevents his mouse click over to look up PNAS and Science and Nature and the Journal of Paleontology and Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology and all the various journals that Acta Paleontologica Polonica, all of these things. What keeps him from doing that? May I suggest bloody lack of curiosity and gumption and skill set, just as a working hypothesis? You know, what can I say?
Arrogance, among other
arrogance.
things. This is the guy who's like, yeah, well, I know these other creationists have PhDs and they think I'm wrong, but that's okay. I'm right, they're wrong.
Yeah, simple as that.
It's that guy.
One of my earliest YouTubes that I did, and you can hunt it up somewhere back on the channel, is Kent Hovind is the Donald Trump of creationism, or or Donald Trump is the Kent Hovind of American politics. Either way, that's somebody who is so ignorant, so arrogant, so self-assured, so Dunning-Kruger cocky, that anybody who takes them seriously cannot be taken seriously. Because at the moment that they do, you realize you don't fact check.
But
these
RJ,
people, do you?
Whirlpools.
Yeah, and
Yes.
even Dapper, one of the nicest people on YouTube, no longer has any ounce of respect to Kent after his most recent
No, well, you
idiocy.
can't.
Incident.
There are personable ones. Duane Gish was quite personable, as by all accounts. He was annoying and would just repeat the same claptrap over and over again. The Gish Gallop is named in his honor for a bloody reason. He's an archetypal form of it, and it's still being used today. Others, by all accounts, Paul Nelson, who's the young Earth creationist intelligent designer, he's amiable and pleasant. I bumped into Douglas Axe and Ann Gager and Steve Meyer and Jonathan Wells very briefly, and that in various contexts. And they're not vituperative.
Was Jonathan Wells on the run? Was it
no,
very brief
no.
because he saw you and
he
started to run?
Oh, it was a weird thing. It was at a intelligent design coffee clutch that they do every year, although maybe not this year. They probably would have had to have canceled it because of the coronavirus.
Well, they'll just pray COVID away. You know, that's all it is.
It's a conservative religious school over in Seattle that does an intelligent design week every year, and they bring in a slew of intelligent design speakers and put little copies of their book out for them to buy outside. And school teachers and various other people in orbit in that framework come in, and good audience. I think it was like easily 400, 500, 600 people in the hall for this thing, the one that I attended. And I was there having done my research on Slam Dunk, and I wanted to ask Jonathan Wells, what contribution did he do to the reptile mammal transition section of the book he did with Bill Dembski? Because he typically was more prone to finagle paleontology than Dembski ever was. Dembski is not a fossil geek, whereas Jonathan Wells in the Icons of Evolution and others tries to pass himself off as that and venture into it. So I wanted to know his contribution. It was amusing because after he got through with his little spiel, nobody stood up to give him a question. Nobody. So here I was, the one that comes down to the microphone. And I said, I turned around to the audience and said, none of you here have a question for John? Well, I do. So I asked him my question, and I framed it very politely. I wasn't confrontational or anything like that. And his reply was that he didn't have anything to do with it. That all other than the little biological snippets that he contributed to the book, and we're talking about the design of life from 2007, 2008. I go into it a lot in Evolution Slam Dunk, and if you don't have your copy of Evolution Slam Dunk, what the hell's wrong? Anyway, that he that's kind of surprised me. That meant that he was conceding that Dembski did all of the air quotes heavy lifting in that book, other than just a few selected items. And given the number of stupids in there, plus repeating all of the pandas and people, this was kind of a retread of a pandas and people. That was actually a revealing operation on it to discover that. But yeah, I most of the ones we know personally, Mike Riddle was very personable and friendly.
Yeah, if completely
until you didn't
devoid of any intelligent thought.
Until you didn't follow along with the origins or bust issue.
Oh, I mean,
well, no. He was always polite, even when we were arguing with him.
Even when we were like, "What is wrong with you?"
We were angry. He was clueless, and he was always clueless. He's a lower echelon repeater of things he never fact checks, and that's the bit. So that's why the fact checking thing is like the crucifix against the vampire. It's the ultimate weapon, because it's a thing that they can't do in their heads. If they were playing fair with their sources, if they were paying attention to all the relevant data field, and when a fact doesn't fit their model, they would call attention to it and attempt to address it. Well, yipes, there's a whole lot of creationist apologetics that's going to just flash and burn under those circumstances.
Yeah, it was kind of amazing talking to him, because he could not understand every time we explain natural selection to him, he's like, "Oh yeah, that's just creationism." No, it's not. And then when we would try to, it's like, it's trying to explain the mutations and this natural selection, this is speciation. He's like, "Okay, I get all that." It's like, okay, so let's take that. Let's just extend the logic a little bit and connect these species together. No, we can't do that. That's evolution.
Connect the dots. Ooh, that's not a game. If they had a connect the dots game, there would always just be circles around the circles. There would never actually be any dots connected. They would get it all completely wrong on that front. And so that's another matter of you want to have a series of litmus tests where when you engage with an anti-evolutionist, where your data field really well on that point, and better yet, their data field, so that you know where they're going to be coming from, and that means you can be in a position.
Colton, have you seen anything about Michael Behe's most recent book?
Is that Darwin Devolves?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
We have a creationist on the subreddit who keeps trying to bring it up.
Well,
and
one of the
doesn't
funniest
go too well.
things that Behe says in that book, I've only seen a few snippets of it. Some creationists dropped it a bit on me. The funniest thing that I saw, and it made me lose a lot of respect for Behe, was he said, the finches made it to the Galapagos about 2 million years ago. Isn't it reasonable we should have a new phylum by now? A new phylum of finches in 2 million years? Are you insane?
Well, there again.
It gets worse no matter how much you think it just can't get any worse than this. Someone always surprises you.
You got to remember Behe's background. He is a biochemist. He is not a paleontologist, and he's written a bunch of books. By now, if he had and lots of postings, if he had even a tiny little fragment of a smidge of a nubbin of interest in paleontology, it would have shown by now, and it ain't there. So that means when he's talking about something like that, all of that vast systematic data field that you would need to address on that point, poof, it's never in his head.
Behe was the same guy who said you can't evolve the immune system, and then somebody dropped him like 4 textbooks, and he said, no,
Yes,
that doesn't count.
That was at the Dover trial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the same.
Yeah,
guy.
there's a lot of material. I have again, more plugging for my work. Chapter 4 of the old tip at my website is Creationism Light, which all the ideology, but even less fact, that went into the basics of Behe's thing, and the problems that he had philosophically with it, and a lot of the technical criticism that had been delivered at that time. When I went back into the issue for the new work for TIP, I went into his discussion of the impipenum resistance case that he brought up at the Dover trial, that I was intrigued to find out why that's an interesting issue, because that involves like a diseasey thing. Is there a theodicy problem there? Let's figure all that out. And it turns out he was really superficial when it came to the impipenum case. And then I pulled the stops out for chloroquine, which is currently Jonathan Wells they've just put a post up, I think Klinghoffer just did on the Discovery Institute, saying, oh, they're going to be using chloroquine for fighting COVID. Oh, that's an issue that Michael Behe has discussed in detail in his book, because I went through that whole chloroquine case in Evolution Slam Dunk, analyzing why he was so far removed from that data field. He was misrepresenting his primary sources. He was avoiding following through on it. He literally had to step over, in a posting that he did in 2013, he literally had to step over the technical paper that showed the multiple natural pathways that chloroquine resistance could develop. And he was still insisting that it was a line in the sand where that it would be physically impossible to generate a class variation because of this supposed chloroquine boundary. So he was arguing that the reptile-mammal transition specifically could not have occurred because chloroquine resistance was too difficult, and therefore anything more complicated than that can't originate naturally.
Yep.
Never did he discuss any reptile-mammal transition data. Zero, zip, nada. He was trying to jujitsu it off the field with a chloroquine example, the facts of which he got wrong.
Well, as Colton said, you think you've hit rock bottom. They will always surprise you.
Never underestimate the field of it. And the
Nephilim free.
That's why
it's rock bottom.
That's why our side
basement rock
wants to get the information onto the field and poke at the anti-evolutionist with the very carefully framed question. And then, of course, we want to be able to respond to their questions effectively, to where they say, oh, well, what about the Cambrian explosion? Oh, thank you for bringing it up, and not shy away from it.
I would love to talk to an idea about the Cambrian, because they know so little about it. It's ridiculous. I mean, they only read Steve Meyer, and they think, oh, I know all about the bull crap. You don't.
All about it, yeah. We got it, because after all, there's no new phylum coming along. Our phyla, that and you know it.
Well, that would explain why they keep going on about how, oh, well, look, basically all modern animals showed up, and it's only like the most basal phylum showing up in the Cambrian explosion.
And that's
it's
what
because people like Behe think you should be getting a new phylum every million years.
Yeah, because
and
of
that's what I was
finches.
saying. Well, because even in there, even Meyer, I guarantee, because Meyer says that every phylum is like, or approximately a phylum is like a kind, basically. I guarantee if you ask him if like, is Morella related to modern centipedes? Are elephants related to Hycoichthyes or descended from Hycoichthyes? Are we descended from Hycoichthyes? No, they're not going to say these things. He doesn't.
Jackson, you would have lost them at Hycoichthyes.
Yeah, it's a kind of poem, isn't it?
Bring up the Commandants. See how far they get with that.
If they even, they won't even know what that is. Yeah.
And so that was
Tell
one
me
of the
what the
reasons
kinds
why
of
we made a big
foraminifera are.
Oh, please do.
One of the killer questions. Then anybody can make use of this, and you got to make sure you have an understanding of it yourself when you do it, of course. But it's a bites. Is ask an anti-evolutionist. Okay, you're bringing up the phyla. Do you accept that anything alive today is physically descended from any of those Cambrian phyla? And you're going to get crickets because they literally never thought about it.
Well,
and
they
you
also
can't
don't
get them to
think
think about it.
Yeah, you're right. And they also don't think about only half. What is it? Oh, just over half, if I remember correctly, of the phyla have fossil records. It's like just over half of them. So,
as a matter of fact, a certain book, The Rocks Were There, has an appendix which lists off all the animal phyla alphabetically and then thematically by what they're related to and whether there's protostomes and deuterostomes, with technical literature applying to it and a representation of their fossil record, including trace fossils. Ta-da! and that can give you a way to navigate through it. And the fact of the matter is,
because once you start, and
yeah, go ahead.
I might have lagged. I probably cut out, and that's what was happening.
Yeah,
I was roboting probably. Yeah, they don't think about how many phyla are actually in the fossil record, how many of them actually have fossil records going back to the Cambrian, because not all of them do. Nematodes only go back to like the Jurassic. Rotifers only go back to the Eocene. So not even into the Paleozoic. And of course they won't think about it. They won't think most of them have never heard of most of the phyla. You'd think most of them have heard of orthonectids or polyplacophorans. No, they haven't heard of those things. They have no idea what those are. So, or rhombozoans? No.
Yeah, and you would think that if they were
subpunculates,
if they were serious about their mythology, they would be really anxious to get all of these ducks in a row. They would be anxious to explain all of this stuff, to work it into their thing, to work out how many phyla there are, how they're recorded. Although,
RJ, that's leading to testability, and if it's testable, it's falsifiable.
I know,
and they can't have that.
Could you imagine? Jay Leno used to do this, and I think what's his name on the ABC, the late night talk show. I don't watch him all that often, but he will occasionally go out and they'll ask questions of people, or they'll have a guy that will be mispronouncing things and deliberately trying to get ridiculous answers to stuff. I find it hilarious to go out and try to ask average anti-evolutionists how many of the organisms that they've ever heard of. Another test that I've been putting up, and I mentioned it occasionally when I'm watching stuff, it was on Dapper Dino. He had a little interlude when he went to get a new drink, and he put up a little thing where there was a cascade of transitional fossil examples. And I said, that's actually a useful test, because how many of the fossils, when you see them, can you recognize? Even if you can't necessarily remember the name, can you tell, oh, that's a dinosaur, that's a theropod, oh, that's a mammal of some kind, probably post-Pleistocene or something like that, that you would be able to put them into categories and structures on that. I would bet the average anti-evolutionist is going to be just in vapor cloud level on virtually all of those.
Yeah, one of the creationists, or the Pentecostal, well, they were creationists, the Pentecostal group that came to LSU, Baton Rouge, and they would yell at the kids they were going to class and all that. I was talking to one of their people, and I mentioned transitional fossils, and she was like, "Oh, there's only like 5 of those." I was like, "What? No."
I mean, first of all, isn't one a problem? And
Yeah, there should be none.
Yeah, exactly. That's a fair point. I didn't think of that. That's a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's like, well, I think I used the analogy in the old book. It's like somebody complaining about the damn chess playing dog. He only wins a third of his games. I mean, what are you making such a big deal out of?
It's like, what?
But in fact, we know not only is there more than one, there's quite a few predicted ones. That's even beyond just finding post hoc that something fits into a phylogenetic framework and it now makes even better sense. No, it's the one where here it is, what we are predicting must have existed. And it turns out, oh yeah, that actually did. Thank you, Fossil Genie.
I think my favorite one, I can't remember its name, but it was the transition between like wasps and ants.
Spicamirma.
Yeah.
We discussed that in the book. And in fact, we got a
remember that from one of Jackson's videos.
And Slam Dunk, I got a big section on that, in particularly about what happened, because ants were one of the examples that Michael Denton made the mistake of bringing up in his 2016 book. And he just had this barrage of jargon and terminology that was supposed to wow us. And I go, excuse me, but if you're using jargon in a book that's not exactly a technical work, shouldn't you be explaining to the reader what this shit means? Well, I decided to ferret out what all the damn jargon meant and follow up on all of his sources. And it turned into quite an extensive section. And I learned way more about Sphecomirmids than he was doing. So that's another plug for Slam Dunk. Get the book and read up on the Sphecomirmids.
Yeah. There was also a transition between bees and wasps, because bees and ants are just wasps. One became vegetarian and one became colonial. So
yeah, there's a whole slew. And of course, a lot of that is happening fairly recently, only like 70, 80, 100 million years ago. That's just, I blink a lot after the things. And that map of time problem is one of the gigantic stumbling blocks for all, underline, boldface, italicized, all anti-evolutionists. They just can't wrap their head. There's no map of time in their heads. If they're a young earth creationist, of course, they're trying to squish it down into a really, really, really thin slice. If they're intelligent designers or old earth creationists, it's just a giant fog bank of there's a Cambrian off in the distance, that there's stuff going on in there. Well,
God was having fun.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and that's as far as it goes.
Why would you do that?
I can't take old earth
John Wick in the
creationists
chat
seriously.
says, Raw Matt and Standing for Truth proved a kind boundary on NDD the other day against a zoologist.
Oh,
No.
I
I
believe that's the debate. I'd like a
rather
timestamp
doubt
so I
that,
can
Mr.
confirm
Wick.
that, because I highly doubt it.
Cool.
TD, that's a breach of the 9th commandment right there. So
Yeah. First of all, which zoologist, John, and which kind boundary were they doing?
And what were their
on
sources?
And
how
what
did they
sources
fact
did they
check it?
give for it? Because we
yeah.
surveyed the baraminology literature fairly extensively for our book.
well, it's
And
funny.
so I suspect that they have not hit any area that we are not already familiar with. And if they are, well, then bring it on, Buckaroo.
It's there we are going to be putting out, or not me personally, but someone on my channel is going to be putting out some information relating to the mitochondrial DNA stuff and how Dumb and Dumber screw it up royally. So expect that in the coming week.
John says the whole debate was on kind boundary. Apparently, I couldn't understand it all. To be honest, it was technical. Oh, well, raw mat and SFT may sound technical.
Well, that's probably like what Erica was talking about, because she was having a talk with Raw Matt, and he was talking about basically I think he was using mitochondrial DNA and talking about, okay, well, this is a group of related species, and she was like, okay, but what's the argument here? No one's denying that they're related. What exactly are you trying to argue? And apparently that he wasn't arguing that there was like a boundary there, just that they were related.
Yeah. It'd be really funky. I know Standing for Truth is prone to waving created heterozygosity, because he copied that little term from Tompkins.
Jeanson,
I
right?
know. Yes, calm down, Jackson.
It's just such absolute bullcrap.
Hey, here's how our model failed its predictions. That means miracle. Checkmate.
Exactly. You can only pass on. I mean, the very idea is just absolute nonsense. You can only pass on like
Two alleles,
if
right?
Yeah,
Or
if
am I
you're
stupid?
well, if you're a sexually reproducing organism, if you're like a human, you can only pass on one allele per locus because
Yeah.
you send your
Michael Behe snagged
DNA
on
and
the same point. He brought it up in his older book, I think his first book, and it was kind of never heard from again. And that was the idea of kind of like an organism, that he could accept kind of like common descent for everything. And there would be a perfectly created original organism. And Ken Miller was saying, including all the bacterial genes and all of the stuff that's in vertebrates and all that was in this organism. Why don't we see the traces of that in all of the descendants of those
How would
organisms?
that
At which
function? I
point,
would imagine the different genes would contradict each other,
yeah.
and it
You
wouldn't
get
work.
into a mess of things. And then, of course, the other area that we have probably more space devoted to when you add up all of the stuff is the discussion of why the creationist notion of genetic information is a pile of dingo's kidneys. We got a lot on that.
There was an article on creation.com, which the Debate Evolution subreddit praised us. We got them to write by asking, just give us your definition, because one of the writers is on our subreddit. And I kid you not, his definition was, you can't put a number on it, but it's intuitive. You can just tell. So when I asked, okay, well, gene duplication and one copy getting made into something new while the old's preserved, that seems intuitively like a change. Oh, no, that's not. So I was like, okay, so the intuition is only correct when it's a decrease. Got it.
The cognitum.
the cognitum,
Obviously.
yeah.
No,
Oh my
it's
God.
the proof of the thing is in the pudding. That if creationism was a viable model, they would be really great and anxious to incorporate every scrap of information. They would, for one thing, be generating the information. They would be doing the genetic studies. They would be looking, cataloging the zoology and so forth and so on. And they would just be Johnny on the spot. And when you look again and again and again, some of them try to be comprehensive. Susan Leitner's thing on the avian kinds lists off all the extant avian groups. She decides, speaking of your Michael Behe and his phylum issue, she acknowledges that not only all of the finches, but their close cousins are all, 1,200 of them are all one created kind, which suddenly flushes down the drain every creationist who is insisting that speciation can't have occurred at all amongst the
Well, yeah, because that's like finches, tanagers. That's a bunch of passeriformes.
Yeah. And then, of course, where do you draw the line next?
They're just making up
and
numbers.
Of course, she cleverly did not discuss any genetics, and she cleverly did not include any fossils. So there we go. Simple.
Easy enough. Yeah, that kind of reminds me of when Leitner said, when she made that claim that morphology does not correlate with genetics, and her citation was a paper talking about a specific phylogenetic arrangement of mammals within a specific group, and really the only takeaway was hooves evolved twice rather than once, because she was the paper was comparing the Pegasiferia hypothesis to the Scrotophera hypothesis, and it's like, okay, what? How did you draw that from this paper? Oh boy.
Yeah, which he didn't. My favorite was John Woodmarapp and the damned thing on the reptile mammal transition. He tried to argue that mammals couldn't really be put into a series of transitional forms in the therapsids because supposedly there were all these reversals that were taking place. And one of the reversals involved a bone that was about the size of a tip of a toothpick. And there was a little witty bitty little bump that would occasionally show up or not on that tiny little bone. And that flipping on and off reversal was one of the things that he used to try to ignore all the rest of the animal and all the other fossil data. This is not only grasping at straws, it's forgetting to bring the straws with you.
It's grasping at toothpicks.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that was
worse.
the one that I was delighted when I sent the paper off to J.G. Liu of the Carnegie Museum to vet it, to make sure, because it was involving Woodmarapp was criticizing his work, among others. And he vetted to make sure that all of my descriptions and details were correct and so forth and so on.
Oh,
Wouldn't you love to see some creationists who would actually try to have their material vetted by the scientists first?
oh yeah, Colton. I used to work for when I was at LSU Veterinars. I worked for this mammologist named Jake Esselstyn, and he discovered a new species of shrew, or a couple new species of shrew rats. One of them was Posidentomes, is very bizarre species. But one of the, I think it was Georgia Purdom actually. She wrote up a little paper on his article about Posidentomes, and she said there is no new information here. It's not a new kind of shrew rat. And so I showed it to Dr. Esselstyn. He just looked at it and kind of laughed and said, "All right, back to work." And so, it's like,
how dare they ignore the true
Well, we've gone on
creation
for-
science?
I mean, that's how little researchers actually care about what creationists do. So
We've gone on an hour and a half here. I suppose we should let scientist Mel get back to her life there in the time zone. And thank you very much.
you.
Does anybody have any final questions or comments or postmortems to put in before we pull the plug?
Oh,
Did you enjoy your experience on our little show, Colton?
I like it.
Ain't science fun, and ain't creationist bashing even funner?
That it is.
well, I guess the only thing I have to mention is that, regards earlier to birds and dinosaurs, if you took the skeleton of Archaeopteryx and a skeleton of Velociraptor, put them right on next to each other, and didn't tell anybody that ear was a bird or a dinosaur, they probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference very well.
Yeah, my 3 Macroevolutionary Episodes book at TIP, you can download the PDF of that. That's got pictures in it. And I went into that issue of how hard it was to tell a Deinonychid from Archaeopteryx and birds in general, and why the pelvic structure evolved. Poor Kent Hovind was still blithering on about bird hip versus lizard hip. I went into all of the reasons why that's claptrap. It's irrelevant to the point at issue, because the Deinonychids have an evolved Saurischian pelvic layout where it's starting to look more and more and more bird-like.
so do the Therizinosaurids.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just such a, oh well, it's Kent Hovind.
Well,
Yeah.
RJ, John Wick is asking if you will debate SFT
I have already.
and Raw Mat on
We've already
Kinds.
done that, haven't we?
Yeah, well, I have never refused to debate him. So if they want to set it up, if it's going to be a 2-on-1, I'll want somebody else there so we can have some fun. Yeah, I've got oops. Yes, I'm finding that biblical kinds on speciation. If you're hearing that suddenly, I got to turn the thingy off here. I do want to follow that up.
He
Yeah, come on,
mentioned
let me get
that
that thing so
there at the beginning,
I can turn the
There-
damn speaker.
the SFT and Raw Mat mentioned
No,
something called
SFT is
barcoding,
constantly
which I know what he's
saying-
talking about. And to be honest,
SFT is always saying he wants to do a debate with me again, but he never sets it up. What's preventing it? It's
Oh
like
my
Kent
God, is
Hovind.
he-
No, I've never refused to debate somebody. I would like to have a topic that's going to be exploratory and interesting, not wheel spinning. And I certainly wouldn't want a topic where SFT can just spew his arguments, which he tends to do. But we can deal with it. I think I'd like to discuss paleontology, which I don't think SFT really knows all that much about, other
Nope.
than what he has copied from the creationist literature. So anyway, that will probably do us for the week. And you can shut us down, Scientist Mel, so you can get back to your life. Thank you again.
Awesome.
You have
Thanks,
been
Mel.
so wonderful to be able to host this.
I'm happy to do it. You guys have an awesome night.
Yeah, we try to
You
get
too.
along here. We're all in our little cocoons of isolation to avoid dropping dead.
Good night, guys.
Yeah,
Bye,
everybody
Mel.
take care. Wash your hands.
Bye,
Don't
Mel.
accept any wooden penguins.